My name is Lars Drudgaard. I come from the International Center Against Abuse of Covert Technologies. And I have a background in electronic development engineering and sound engineering. I became exposed to and interested in this technology about 3.5 years ago when I sent off a job application to the Danish Defense Intelligence Service. I didn't make much of it at the time, and after a couple of months I was declined, meaning I did not get the job. But straight away and gradually increasing the spring that followed, I was exposed to some of those technologies on the receiving end. So since then it has been an investigation into those technologies, and I'm going to show you a little bit of what has come out of it so far. I'll start up with a little bit of the history, skip through some of the things pretty fast, and then I will go into modern day science, what we are researching today, or what is being researched today, and then I'll end up with the ICAACT, International Center Against Abuse of Covert Technologies, and what we are all about. So I won't be covering my personal story very much. This is more like what the technology is all about. So, some of the things that started in the early 1900s with the eugenics movement. I just skipped the one here. And the eugenics movement was about racial prejudice. And it became heavily funded by some of the industrialists in the United States, the Rockefellers, the Kellogg's family, and others. And they were, especially the Rockefeller family, were very much funding the social engineering sciences and behavior sciences. And a lot of the technologies that come today have a basis in behavioral sciences. So I'll just quickly skip through some of them. Pavlov and his dogs, we just saw before, was very famous for measuring saliva from dogs and children and determining that when they felt hungry, they produced their saliva. And after a while, when they were exposed to men in white coats, they started to have the saliva without the food. So this was the conditioning process he noticed. John B. Watson determined by his work with children that behavior is dictated by fear and not love. Basically, that's his conclusion. And next one is, of the big behavior scientists, is Hobart Murrah. He coined the expression frustration aggression. He put some of his students through some electrocution signals, just not extremely painful, but so that they could feel them. And every time they were having those, he switched a light on. And he determined after a while that when he switched the light on, the anticipation of the electrocution signal actually produced greater anxiety and fear than when it actually came. So this is very important studies for psychological torture. B.F. Skinner experimented on pigeons. He's known for his Skinner box. And basically he determined how to train pigeons and make them do certain tasks related to food. So Stanley Milgram did a very important experiment that was related to authority and how far people will go even towards torture and killing people based on the commands of authority. When we came to the World War II, the Germans had taken over the eugenics program already in the 1920s, and they had a good brain trust of people in the behavioral sciences, like psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. And Hitler, of course, used the eugenics system to justify the creation of an enemy to unite his people and get them together behind him. Someone had to take the blame for his power ambitions. So the next clip I want to play, I just want to play a little song.
Die Gedanken sind frei, my thoughts freely flower. Die Gedanken sind frei, my thoughts give me power. No scholar can map them, no hunter can trap them, no man can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no man can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure. My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure. My thoughts will not cater to duke or dictator, no man can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no man can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. And should tyrants take me and throw me in prison, my thoughts will burst free like blossoms in season. Foundations will crumble and structures will tumble and free men will cry. Die Gedanken sind frei and free men will cry. Die Gedanken sind frei.
This is actually a very old German folk song. I chose an English interpretation by Pete Seeger to make it more understandable. The significance and why I chose it with World War II beginning is it became the theme song of a German resistance group called Weiße Rose or White Rose. And it touches on some of the subjects our thoughts might not be free anymore. So, when Hitler came to power, his creation of scapegoat enemies within and without, he basically adopted completely the eugenics movement, and they had an enormous scientific boost in Germany, and they had some strange ideas like banning all science and research on animals. And that meant that they were limited to human beings. And this went on in the concentration camps, Dachau, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald, and others. One of the scientists I want to just pick out, I just picked one, because it's an interesting case, is Dr. Kurt Blome. He was deputy health minister, and he studied bacteriological warfare. And he exposed prisoners to plague, vaccines, mescaline, sarin gas, and other things. And he was actually an extremely nasty science that he did in the concentration camps. In the Nuremberg trials, he was acquitted. And it was very much suspected that the Americans had a strong hand in this acquittal because he had actually confessed to his crimes. So the Nuremberg trials were set up by the Allies, the Russians, the British, the French, and the Americans. And they all contributed with the legal personnel to conduct the Nuremberg trials. There were the major trials were the political and military leadership, the industrialists who funded the wars, and the doctors' trials. And this Kurt Blome was acquitted because the Americans saved him. The Americans very much wanted him to cooperate and go to the United States. Especially the CIA and military were interested in his work. He made an agreement with them and shared his work and his research with them. And the operations that where the Americans wanted and British wanted the brain trust of the Germans was called paperclip. That's the most famous of them. There were other projects like Project 63 and National Interests that did the same. About 2,000 of the highest scientists in Germany were all moved to the US. Kurt Blume could not get there because he was denied a visa, and the Americans were pretty frustrated with that. So they set him up in a little village outside Frankfurt, where they had their interrogation and torture chamber, the CIA. And he became the house doctor of this torture center for the CIA. The French were very unhappy with that, so they apprehended him at some point and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. But a year later, the Americans got him out of that. Later on, he was sent to the United States with Project 63 and worked for the US Army Chemical Corps. So that's just a little bit about the morals and ethics that surrounded the Nuremberg trials. Post-World War II research, there was still a big interest in behavior modification, interrogation, truth drugs, Manchurian candidates, unwitting spies, chemical weapons, and biological weapons. Especially the behavioral modification and interrogations and truth drugs, there was a big brain trust by the Germans. The CIA and US military established a lot of research projects that were highly classified at the time. Here's a list of them. Most people have heard of MKULTRA, but there was a whole list of other projects. I'll just skip very quickly through them. So Bluebird and Artichoke were the two first ones, and they were very significant. They started in 1950, before the Korean War. The Americans often claimed that the reason for their mind control programs and behavior modification programs was because the Koreans had used it, so they needed to look into it. But they actually started before that. By 1954, they had fully fledged Manchurian candidates. This means people who will kill, who will get hypnotized to do atrocious acts like shooting other people, carrying bombs, and have complete amnesia about it. This is documented in their own documents. About 20,000 documents have been released in the Freedom of Information Act requests, and that this is fully documented that those were operational in 1954. Project Chatter, I'll just skip through, QK Hilltop, MK Delta. Some of them have to do with different aspects of it. Some of them, the chemicals, the hypnosis, the foreign things, Europe, East, etc., etc. Chiquid, often, MK Naomi, Stargate. Stargate is a little bit different. It's not one of the traditional mind control programs. There are two programs that were related to extra sensory ESP stuff, parapsychology, etc. And they studied remote viewing and remote influencing. So the remote influencing part kind of falls into that category a bit. And there was a big overlap of scientists working on the project, so that it was closely related, even though it's not strictly mind control interrogation based. Sleeping Beauty is a project that was not confirmed. It's referenced in other documents, but all Freedom of Information Acts are denied, and it has to do especially with remote influencing with the electronic signals. MKUltra and MK Search were umbrella projects. That's why they are the most known ones. MKUltra had 149 sub-projects, and that was all kinds of different experiments. Mind control was not limited to the United States. In Denmark, it was carried out on 500 unwitting subjects. They were victims of LSD experiments in a Copenhagen hospital, literally in the basement. A quarter of the 500 people committed suicide very fast after they were subjected to this, and the rest basically had a miserable life from there on. One man stood up, a farmer from Jylland, where we are here. Gunnar Sandvej was his name. He fought relentlessly for 20 years against the hospital and the Danish government. He was labeled all kinds of things, and he was basically fighting in vain. It wasn't until 1985 when a book was written on his story, and a TV documentary. It created public outcry, and the politicians were forced to basically pay the compensation to the victims and acknowledge that it did happen. In Norway, there was also 500 victims. The difference was they were all children, and they were all German refugees. They have not been compensated yet. The MKULTRA program, also some of the sub-projects had to do with electronic implants. Sub-projects 61, 129, 94, and 142. And I want to take one of those, and I want to read this document. Memorandum for the record. Subject, Project MKULTRA, sub-project number 142. 1. The purpose of this sub-project is to provide funds to support a small biological program of electric brain stimulation involving some new approaches to the subject. Redacted. This support allows for the rental of minimum space and equipment and the part-time employment of a pair of hands to carry out the work planned by Redacted. The reason for separating this work financially from other efforts of Redacted in the agency's behalf is to allow him to engage in some very practical experiments at some point in the work which would present security problems if this effort were to be handled in the usual way. Some of the uses proposed for these particular animals would involve possible delivery of systems for biological and chemical warfare agents, or for direct executive action type operations as distinguished from the eavesdropping application of Redacted. There are a couple of interesting things in this. Executive action means murder. That's the term used for killing people. It is carried out very secretly, and I really noted this expression as distinguished from the eavesdropping applications of, which meant when this was written, they already had implants for eavesdropping on people. This, when I go all the way back to the top, this was 22nd May 1962, 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, they could implant people and they could be unwitting spies. There were a lot of people, Dr. Heath and many others, who were involved in brain electrode implants. The most famous is Dr. José Delgado. He worked at Yale and had naval funding for his work. He did a lot of different experiments, both on animals and humans. And we're going to see a famous little video here. This is done where he implants a bull in Cordoba in Spain. This is 1965. Here the bull has not been implanted yet. We can see it's still aggressive, fighting the matador. Then it's sedated and gets its operation done right there. Now it's still aggressive, fighting the matador. And then this is José Delgado. In his hand he has a radio transceiver basically, when he flicks the switch, the bull will turn. This was 1965. Some of the other things that went on were research into radio frequency, microwave and magnetic waves. I think Barry Trower has touched on those. And I'm going to show you a couple of videos. I have a video in here by Russian, but it's in German, so I'll just skip through it very quickly, and then we'll jump to some of the other ones. Even though Smirnov is very important, I want to keep this English. So this one is a device that the East Bloc developed to equip their diplomatic corps with a little box-size device to protect them from enemy mind control. So diplomats and agents were equipped with this thing.
Is there any defense? This personal transmitter puts out 7.8 cycles a second, which Minkowski says is a natural planetary frequency the body is tuned to. It swamps the incoming signal from the woodpecker. Remove the transmitter's protective field, and the Russian signal reasserts itself.
It is being used, as far as we are aware, by the German civil service. There in Germany it's called Weiterset. And it is mainly a protective mechanism to ensure that a German civil servant, especially on external affairs duty, is able to keep his composure in negotiations, or especially with other people, other countries, to make sure that they're not influenced.
The German government denies using the Weiterset, but Minkowski is sure it works.
So the next video is about a couple of different types of tools, radio waves, microwaves, electromagnetic fields that were employed, and after his work with the implants, Delgado even turned to this.
But the beauty is that now we are not using electrodes.
In recent years, Delgado has shown that the behavior of monkeys can be altered using low-power, pulsating magnetic fields. But in these experiments, there were no antenna implants.
Any function in the brain, emotions, intellect, personality, well, could be perhaps modified by this non-invasive technology.
Delgado's research has so far been limited to animals. But in the Soviet Union, a radio frequency, or RF device, has been used for over 30 years to manipulate the moods of mental patients. It's called a LIDA machine. It radiates pulses of radio frequency energy, as well as light, sound, and heat. The pulse rate is in the extremely low frequency range, between 0 and 100 pulses per second. Dr. Ross 80 is the top researcher at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Loma Linda, California. He has been investigating the effects of the LIDA machine.
Now, what do the Soviets use this machine for?
Well, they don't use it anymore. We should be very clear that this is a machine which is regarded by them as somewhat obsolete technologically.
This scientist, who did not want his identity revealed, is employed by the U.S. government and has done secret RF weapons research. He believes that tests done with the LIDA and similar machines prove that humans are susceptible to remote alterations of mood and awareness.
Certain kinds of weak electromagnetic signals work exactly like drugs. And so the promise is that anything you can do with drugs, you could do with the right electromagnetic signals.
Induce basically what would be considered hallucinations in people, direct them to do things against their so-called better judgment.
How easy would it be to assemble a weapon from existing off-the-shelf parts?
In 3 weeks, I could put together a weapon that would take care of a whole town.
One of the most famous scientists in the field of electromagnetic fields induced in the human brain and what it creates is Professor Dr. Michael Persinger from the Laurentian University. He was tied up to the non-official program Sleeping Beauty, and he was also, according to some of the remote viewers in Grill Flame and Stargate doing research on them initially. Here's a little video with him.
To compare that.
The research is led by Dr. Michael Persinger.
Basically, at any given time, all experience is due to those portions of the brain that are most metabolically active. If we can simulate that by applying complex, meaningful magnetic fields to the brain, we can also induce those experiences.
The volunteer sits blindfolded in a soundproof chamber. This sensory deprivation allows the mind to focus on electromagnetic patterns transmitted across the brain through this modified crash helmet. Dr. Persinger hopes the research will benefit psychotherapy.
We tried to evoke the fragments that compose the near-death experience and other mystical experiences, such as detachment, feelings of moving through a tunnel, hearing voices, the sense of a presence, usually on the left side. Our major thrust is ultimately to apply this to dealing with things such as psychological depression. If you stimulate the deep portions of the temporal lobe, so you can get very, very vivid imagery, and the emotional commitment or the emotional sensation that something is profound, real, cosmically real, and personally significant.
It's a male voice, but it's like really, really far away. As if you can just sort of like catch
a tone. You can't really hear. You can tell that it's someone talking. You can distinguish that, but you can't make out any kind of words or anything like that.
What we've been doing recently is generating words as magnetic patterns. And even though the person isn't hearing it through their ears, their brain is interpreting it. So they're actually having fragments of experiences as if they're hearing it when in actual fact it cannot be. But one thing that's really clear, you can control the person's experiences and they don't know they're being controlled. That's why this technology is a potentially powerful one and has a two-edge to its sword.
As a tool of science, this technology may bring us valuable new understandings of the obscure depths of the human mind. But there's a dark side. In the wrong hands, could it become an instrument of power, a means of oppression? If we're not careful, will mind games one day become mind control?
In the 1970s, the CIA's wrongdoing were starting to become apparent, and there was a committee formed to investigate the wrongdoings. It's commonly referred to as the Church Committee. It was after the chairman of the committee, Senator Frank Church. It also had a subcommittee chaired by the late Edward Kennedy that looked into especially the MKULTRA programs. Richard Helms, the CIA director at the time, had ordered all documents destroyed, but they forgot about some boxes that were tucked away in a warehouse somewhere. That's why we have a lot of, there are 20,000 documents still available. One of the people who were involved in those MKULTRA programs was Miles Copeland. Most of you might know he is a musician, and a rather famous one. But he was also a CIA agent working with the MKULTRA program. And he stated to a reporter that the committee only got the barest glimpse of what was going on. So, okay. Yes, but I know he also plays with plays some, I don't know. So, and he also said that the research went into the electronics after that, but it was transferred to a different department in the CIA called ORD. After 1973, Governor Ronald Reagan in California proposed that prisoners should be implanted with devices developed by José Delgado to track their every move and monitor them and basically catch them if they should escape and control their behavior. This was made public, and it caused public outcry, so the whole project was shut down. But the significance of this is that this was public knowledge in 1973, that this was going on, this was possible. What did those programs amount to? They amounted to physical and psychological torture. Some of the things that have come from them is Kubak, SIR, interrogation drugs, and Manchurian candidates. The Kubak is the name of a CIA interrogation and torture manual. It was released within the Freedom of Information Act in 1996, it says, and it basically outlines a lot of the things that were studied in the MKULTRA programs, that DDD, debility, dread, and etc. So, this research is all very similar to the work that was done by the Nazis. This shows that the brain trust of the programs basically were German and not Chinese. They also studied the Russians and Chinese techniques that were somewhat different. SIR is a school that was set up to protect special operations people, intelligence people, and pilots to avoid getting damaged with those interrogation techniques. The SIR school is built on the findings in the Kubak and the behavior things that the CIA did. In recent years, the SIR school has become famous because they have reverse engineered the torture programs, and what we all have seen is what's happening at Guantanamo Bay, Bagram Air Base, and Abu Ghraib. So, not only the drug system played a major role in the MKULTRA programs. It recently came out that the CIA had enormous stockpiles of a malaria drug called Lariam. The active compound is called mefloquine, and it has some very, very serious side effects. Aggression, paranoia, vertigo, panic, anxiety, insomnia, suicidal tendencies. That's some extreme side effects. And it's recommended to only be given before serious evaluation by doctors. Nonetheless, at Guantanamo, the prisoners were given this drug. Usually, it's given once, 250 milligrams is a recommended dose. The prisoners were inoculated with 1,250 milligrams, 5 times the dose, not once, but weekly. So, basically that is psychological waterboarding. There's one more little fact about this that is indicative of that this is interrogation and torture, deliberate torture. There is no malaria in Cuba. So we're going up to the 70s, and in the times we live in, with the war on terror, I just want to show you what we consider the beginning of terrorism.
Germany, 1967. The children of the Nazi generation have grown up in the ruin their parents created. They vowed fascism would never rule their country again.
Diesmal werden wir Widerstand leisten. Wir haben eine Verantwortung vor der Geschichte. Wir bauen eine Gruppe auf. Wir werden die politischen Verhältnisse ändern.
Wir machen das, wenn wir dabei draufgehen.
Die Männer schlafen hier in dem Gebäude, die Frauen da.
We are staying together. Screwing and shooting are the same. People try to put us down. Just because we get around. Talking about my generation. Things they do look awful. Talking about my generation. Hope I die before I learn.
Wir brauchen eine Spezialeinheit, die darauf trainiert wird, in Zukunft solche Wahnsinnigen auszuknipsen.
Und wir machen die Grenzen dicht. Wir klopfen an einem einzigen Tag die gesamte Bundesrepublik durch.
fight for freedom, they lost themselves in the cause.
Da sind mehr von uns drin als draußen.
And ignited a revolution around the world.
Es läuft total aus dem Ruder.
Meet the original faces of terror.
Ich werde mich niemals damit abfinden, dass man nichts tut. Niemals.
The Baader-Meinhof complex, based on the true story of the Red Army faction.
There is no hard evidence that they have been subjected to any of those techniques. I just want to stress that. But there are a couple of interesting things that surround their cases. In 1962, Ulrike Meinhof, one of the leaders, had brain surgery. And she had a metal object implanted in it, allegedly a metal clamp. And she was a very prosperous young journalist at the time. And all people around her stated that this surgery completely changed her personality. And she basically joined the Baader-Meinhof and became a terrorist. When they were apprehended in 1976, she committed suicide by hanging herself. But at her funeral, her brain was missing. Okay. 1 year later, 3 other members, Andreas Baader, Gudrun Enselin, and Karl Raspe, also committed suicide. Andreas Baader shot himself in the back of his head. Yes. Their brains were also missing when they were at the funeral. In 2002, Ulrike Meinhof's brain reappeared, and it was, once more there was a funeral. The other brains are still missing. So what it is indicative of that there is someone who wants to study this, at least. So, how can we all be controlled collectively? Nick Begich, a Canadian, has done a lot of work into researching the capabilities of a project in Alaska called HARP, or High Aurora Research Facility. And one of the capabilities it has is to transmit ELF waves, extremely low frequency waves, that are the same waves as our brains operate on. So it's very feasible, and he basically makes the point that it was stated in the original planning of the project as well, that it had this capability. Another thing is silent sound spectrum. I jumped over the Smirnov video because it was in German, but basically that is to encode signals into any other signal. It can be a sound signal, it can be a video signal. Hypnotic patterns can be programmed into this, so they cannot be heard, but the subliminally, the subconscious does recognize them and does react on them. And Smirnov states in his work that these signals can be put nationally, but they can also be induced in any signal that is airborne. So you don't have to go into cables to basically use this. So now we're up to modern day science. DARPA is the US military's research facility. They basically have a lot of, get all the money from the Pentagon and redistribute it and to all the projects around. I'll only touch on the neuroscience. Dr. Amy Cruz was the leader of the neuroscience department at DARPA for 5 years, and I'll just show you a little clip of what she did and what she...
The January 2008 issue of Aviation Week carried an article based on interviews with the woman who oversees some of the most provocative current DARPA research. Dr. Amy Cruz began serving as a tech consultant to DARPA's director immediately after receiving her doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Illinois. Now she is in charge of some of the agency's literally most mind-boggling research. Among the items now on her plate, research into computer analysis of brain waves detected from satellites without the subject's knowledge. It's expected to help intelligence analysts precisely identify and locate targets based on the hostile thoughts of enemy forces, and to help leaders in the theater of operations know if their deployed troops are alert enough to realize the intensity of whatever situations they're about to face. Experiments have been run with soldiers whose brain waves are seen by their commanders via wireless computers. When a commander knows a soldier has gone into tunnel vision from information overload, he will know that he has to count on someone else for key actions and commands during an attack. An earlier project, called Augmented Cognition, AUGCOG for short, gave birth to something Cruz is working on currently. That is the Neurotechnology for Intelligence Analysts, NIA program. Phase 2 of the NIA project began recently. Honeywell's work is being augmented with participation from Teledyne Scientific Imaging and from Columbia University, which is aggressively building its neuroscience reputation. Phase 3 is expected to produce a prototype that intelligence agencies will road test. According to Honeywell, the technology is nearly ready for operational use. Altogether, AUGCOG and NIA research has linked several corporate and academic teams with the 4 different military services. Daimler Chrysler with the U.S. Marine Corps, Lockheed Martin with the Navy, Boeing with the Air Force, and Honeywell's team of some 11 industry and university partners with the Army. One of the most brain-twisting and talked-about areas of recent research, for instance, is something called the Active Denial System, or ADS, which was demonstrated in late January 2007 at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia. ADS is the byproduct of larger ongoing research looking for technology that could delete and then replace a person's memories. That last sentence is guaranteed to make any true science fiction fan remember at least 3 recent mainstream movies with variations on the same theme. Another on-the-horizon reality actually seems like a direct lift from science fiction, specifically from Minority Report. And in Science Fact, a team of neuroscientists has actually developed a brain scan-based way of finding hints about what a subject is intending to do. The scientists built their research on findings from earlier studies that used fMRI to understand what goes on in the human brain when the topic at hand is racial prejudice, violence, or lying.
I'm going to show you one more neuroscience, or 2 more neuroscience videos.
More and more, we will be able to measure and understand how our brain cells function. Deciphering our consciousness is another question. But the experiments of Dr. Yang Dan have proved that in principle, it is possible to read and to understand the brain.
I didn't know that we started this thing again. So this is a digitized movie. We present this to the animal, and we record the activity of their visual neurons. And these electrical signals that we recorded from will travel through these cables.
She managed to tap the vision from the brain of a cat and to reconstruct what the cat sees onto a computer screen.
So this is a digitized movie. This particular movie is a short clip from Indiana Jones, I think.
Here we see the 2 images next to each other. On the left, the image that was shown to the cat. At the right, the image that is tapped out of the cat's brain.
Thoughts or something. But we can distinguish that. So when we use all of those, thinking that they represent visual information, this is the reconstruction that we come up with.
It is the first time an image was tapped from a brain. It proves that we can read and understand the grammar of it. The face is recognizable, but I still can't avoid the impression that the face has something cat-like. Other scientists use a completely different approach. They take the brain cells apart and let them grow in a small dish on top of a computer chip. They printed a pattern on the chip with a product that the brain cells love to eat. While consuming the product, the cells get stuck to the right spot and their tentacles are guided by the pattern. This way, the whole network of brain cells can be entirely controlled.
Let me disconnect the light show.
Dr. DeMars, for instance, tries to communicate with his brain dishes and teach them several tasks.
So each of these dishes contains about 20,000 or so neurons, which are firing away as we speak. So each one's an individual network, and they'll fire spontaneously. We take living rat neurons, and they will rapidly form a neural network. And we have this grid of electrodes underneath the surface of these living neurons, and we can listen to the conversation among the neurons. And we can also stimulate activity within that network. We can send in different patterns of stimulation and look at how the network changes as a result of those stimulations. And that's how we do what we do.
What he does is to teach his brain dishes how to control an airplane.
The network can essentially fly the aircraft in a pretty optimal way. So it won't overcorrect too much, and it'll be able to stabilize it in a wide variety of conditions. I think I've programmed like a 50-knot.
You may think you have little in common with this robot, but it is controlled by living brain cells much like those inside your own head. Researchers grew a collection of around 300,000 rat brain cells in the lab. The cells quickly grow connections to each other and start communicating using electrical pulses. When the clump of cells was connected to electrodes, some parts of it were found to respond predictably to signals from the robot's ultrasound distance sensor. The output from these cells can be used to control the robot's motor circuits, preventing it from bumping into obstacles. Because the brain cannot leave the lab, it communicates with the robot wirelessly. The team plan to use their robot's brain power for new patterns of behavior in future. They hope there are enough similarities to teach us about unknown aspects of our own brain activity.
So this shows us basically how far we are. So towards new computing. Some of the things that we deal with in ICAACT that we'll come to shortly are RFID chips, and there are a long variety of different chips. Some are active, some are passive, some have GPS, some can monitor all kinds of vital signs. These are all public, and you can read about them. So they are used in animals and also manufactured for humans. I won't go too much into it. I'll just put together a little compilation of videos, scary videos about
Just about every U.S. military vehicle in Iraq has GPS or another type of electronic tracking device so their commanders can monitor them. It's called Blue Force tracking. Some law enforcement units back home have experimented with chips that give physical data about officers but don't have tracking signals. One option, placing a tracking microchip under a service member's skin. Former U.S. Special Operations officers tell us they believe that's being developed. Current military officials won't comment on that, Wolf.
Is there, for example, a microchip, a watch, a tracking device we can use for our kids?
We are working on a product that we have called internally a PLD. PLD stands for Personal Locating Device, which is an implantable GPS for which our company owns a patent and can be implanted surgically in the clavicle area of a child or someone that you are interested in tracking. It is the first implantable microchip for humans that has multiple security, financial, and healthcare applications.
All right, this next story may sound like something out of, well, a Hollywood thriller. A Saudi inventor has created a killer microchip. It's designed to track terrorists and criminals and, well, you can think of somebody. Not only does it include a GPS device, it also has a lethal dose of cyanide, which can be activated at any time. You get my point? The inventor's bid for a patent has been rejected in Germany. Joining us now this morning to talk about it, Jake Ward, deputy editor of Popular Science. Okay, this is pretty macabre, pretty sinister and nefarious. How exactly would this work?
Well, there's a category of technology that involves GPS tracking systems being shrunk down to the size where you could actually implant it surgically. And we've seen a number of applications for this. This is without question the most sinister version of it that I've certainly heard of. You know, and the notion of tracking criminals is not new, but the notion of killing them remotely, I think, is a whole new thing.
Yeah, and Germany says, look, we're not going to approve this.
That's
because
right.
For that very purpose. And apparently, in some of the paperwork and applying for the patent, you know, you could track fugitives from justice, terrorists, illegal immigrants, criminals, political opponents, defectors, and Saudi Arabians who don't return home from pilgrimage. It's a little bit wild.
I agree. I mean, the thing about you know, this kind of patent is Germany has very tight laws about making sure that you're not registering something that really is just a bad idea, a scary idea. And in this case, this guy obviously has some very strong feelings about what it would be used for, but it just seems a little outlandish.
Yeah, well, terrorist groups might be interested. I'm sure they'd be happy to grant their own form of a patent for that.
Sure.
The bigger world, though, of GPS, talk to us about how it's being used to, for example, track sex offenders.
Sure. The Washington State Legislature right now is considering the possibility of registering perhaps 100 sex offenders with a GPS chip that's implanted in their shoulder because they found that a few of them have been wearing them on their wrists and then have cut them off, which just defeats the purpose. And so
lie detection is becoming a very, very heavily investigated thing in neuroscience. There are two major new techniques that are developed. They both rely on memories that are stored in the brain. The first technique is projecting images to the brain, and if the image of a crime scene, a murder weapon, or anything like that is familiar, memory-related areas in the brain will light up. I speak from personal experience. I have seen such pictures. It's a pretty strange phenomenon. It was just bizarre because I hadn't seen the images before, so there wasn't much to it. The other system is a lot more sinister. It basically locks the brain into a specific topic. They either record and send back a brain pattern to the brain when it's on a specific topic. So they force your brain onto a topic they want to explore. Then they let go, and the brain automatically goes off in different directions they want to go in, and they keep doing this repeatedly for days, weeks, and months until they have explored every aspect of this topic area. And the research has been funded in those by the FBI, the Navy, and the CIA especially. It's said to be MRI, but at the same time it says that the CIA is street testing it. I don't know. Have you seen big MRIs traveling around on trucks? I haven't. So the technology does work on the other techniques as well. That is, but by the way, this is torture beyond imagination when your thoughts are forced. They're no longer in control. Recently, or last year, the US President Obama put together a bioethics commission that was to look into some of the bioethics violations and give guidelines to the president on what's going on. At the meetings, a lot of experts were assembled, and there was open days for people who wanted to complain. And a lot of the people who are subjected to those technologies and torture showed up. Several hundred showed up. They couldn't speak, all of them, and a lot of people were rejected out hand. But it did get through, and I know a lot of people from around the world even sent copies, including myself, to the commission. The report is due in December. I'm looking forward to see if it reflects what they've heard. Next, we are going to see a clip with Dr. Francis Collins. Some of you might know that he was the charge of the Human Genome Project. He's now director of National Institute of Health. He had this comment at the Bioethics Commission.
Dr. Francis Collins is the director of the National Institutes of Health.
Let me just say a word, though, about neuroimaging. Certainly the problem of incidental findings, though, is an enormous, obvious overlap with the genetic situation. MRI scans often give things you didn't expect, and often they're things you don't know what to do with. UBOs, as they're called, unidentified bright objects. Do you want to have one of those in your brain? Well, you might, and what are you going to do with that? Very difficult to say. And then getting again into forensics, lie detection. Certainly there are those who believe this will become a more accurate means of assessing when somebody is practicing deception, and then other available methods. Personality prediction or profiling, again, something that might be used in making decisions about who gets access to which particular kinds of jobs or in the military, or also could be used in courts of law. Neuromarketing, a little scary concept there, trying to assess when people are responding effectively to certain kinds of advertising or branding, or even who's got the brain that's going to be most susceptible to a particular kind of manipulation.
So now we're what I'm actually here about, International Center Against Abuse of Covert Technologies. In the United States, a doctor named John Hall discovered that when measuring with a radio frequency detector, he could detect radio frequencies emanating from people who are symptomatic, who have complained of or been suspicious of being tortured under this system. And according to the doctor, that it's not natural to emanate radio frequency. So Jesse Beltram from Sacramento in California, he decided to make a tour through the US, and I got in touch with him because we have international Skype meetings. And basically we decided, okay, if they're doing it in the US, I'll go through Europe. So they shipped over the equipment to me, and we did it simultaneously, where they traveled in the States and I traveled in Europe. And we're going to see a video clip on that in a moment. First of all, I just want to explain the situation. There are thousands and thousands of people who are victims of this technology around the world. The internet has become sort of a focus point for many, Facebook in particular. And there are also big organizations in Japan, in South Korea, and in the US. I think the biggest US organization, Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance, is about 1,500 members, and Japanese organization has 900 members. Only a fraction are members of the victims. So the problem is enormous. So ICAACT, we decided to create ICAACT to provide hard evidence. Unlike the other groups, we don't have encompass every aspect of the system that we are. We are focusing on a very, very narrow and specific point of this, is to provide some kind of proof that this is going on. So we took on the radio frequencies, and we devised a 3-phase testing. And what we do is we test people with those bug finders. They are basically devices for finding surveillance equipment used by detectives and intelligence services. And we scan people and see if they emit any radio frequencies. And we do find places in very specific narrow focal points. This is not proof. Theoretically, the signal can come from the outside. So to back up any findings, this phase 2 is to get medical images. That could be X-rays, MRI scans, CT scans, etc. And if those two match up, we have some stronger circumstantial evidence. And third phase is to redo the scanning in a Faraday cage to rule out that any radio frequencies are transmitted from the outside, because we live in this radio frequency soup. It's possible. So, but in a Faraday cage, we could basically determine if the signals are indeed emanating from the person. The fourth phase is not on our list, but that is, of course, surgery, if we have a positive result in all the 3 previous phases, to find doctors, get them surgically removed, and then have the smoking gun. And that's the entire mission we have. I just want to show you a video clip, short.
Following are the results of our tour when we started our radio frequency scanning across America in Sacramento, California. Here are some test results that came up positive of victims of domestic terrorism. This is Christopher, 5 years old. Positive in his left shoulder area. Bonnie has been a victim for over a decade. She came up positive for RF transmission in her right TMJ. David came up positive in his right shoulder region. Richard Northern came up positive for RF transmission near his left TMJ area. Barbara has been tortured over the years in many ways, what most women call a silent rape. She came up positive in her lower lumbar, her lower back area. She can pinpoint with needlepoint accuracy where she believes an implant is, and you can see by our RF testing it comes up positive.
In Europe, we started the testing tour in the German capital, Berlin, where I met up with the Swedish lawyer Dr. Henning Witte, who was going to interview the victims while I was doing the testing. The first person tested was Waldemar. He tested positive in both sides in the TMJ area.
Und jetzt ein bisschen weg davon. Ja. Noch tiefer. Von der Antenne weg.
Monica tested positive in her right TMJ area.
So, Antenne wieder hin. Von der Antenne weg. So, Antenne wieder hin.
Here I'm testing Gisela. Gisela came up positive in the TMJ area on both sides.
Sieht man das?
Das ist eindeutig.
She also came up positive in her lower back. Sabine came up positive in her right TMJ area.
Ans Gerät wieder ran.
Sabine also tested positive on her back at the left shoulder area.
Jetzt wieder weg. Wieder zurück. Noch näher ran. Ja, das ist doch ziemlich eindeutig.
As we continued our testing across the United States, our next stop was Kenosha, Wisconsin. Lisa, just as Debbie, has been complaining of being tortured for many years. Lisa came up positive near her left temporal region, just above her ear, and she came up positive near her right temporal area. Lisa gave testimony at the Presidential Bioethics Commission.
Bit to this side.
No, exactly. I thought that.
So this is an MRI scanned, as you can see, and that circled in red is a foreign body that was scanned by Dr. John Hall with the JM20 Pro RF detector, and was emitting in that area a radio frequency emission. And lo and behold, as you see the VeriChip type style RFID, looks very, very similar. In fact, when you superimpose it over, you can see exactly what that appears to be. turn the page on a close-up, so if it's not easily read, you can easily see the coil, the microprocessor, the entire tube. As this figure is blown up, you can see the cylinder-shaped object. It's pretty evident. There you go.
So, what are we finding? Some of the statistics say that were done by surveys with the bigger American organization. They say that approximately 70 to 80% of the victims are female, and we are basically collaborating this. We had 82% of females. Of the symptomatic group, 60.7% were female, 39.29% were male. The females tested 82.35% positive and 17.65% negative. Males 84.5% positive and 15.5% negative. The symptomatic group that came up positive were 89.2% had auditory symptoms, some kind of sound coming to them. So that's what we are finding, and we are currently at phase 1 and phase 2. We're working towards getting to phase 3 and 4, and we hope to manage to get all the way to phase 4 this year. The challenges we are finding at the moment is that there's a whole research field of electronics or science that I jumped, and that is organic electronics. There are a lot of the new technologies that we cannot see on imagery systems. They are completely invisible to X-rays, MRI scans, any type of this thing. We can still find them, or might still find them, with the RF detectors, but it will be very difficult to convince a doctor if we don't get phase 2 with the image to back it up. That's one thing we are facing, is that this implementation of organic electronics. So that's our big challenges. So we hope to prove basically that these crimes do occur while the old technology is still around. There are a couple of known cases. Robert Neslund from Sweden had an implantation in the 1970s, and his was removed. It was quite big. There's no picture of it here. And also a lot of Vietnam veterans were implanted. They were somewhat different. They were to stimulate insulin, or what is it called, to make them aggressive. And there's, what? Adrenaline, yes. And basically to make them aggressive at certain points. The question is, they have sued recently last year the US government, but the question is whether or not this was consented, or at least it was not full and understood consent. So the next one here is David A. Larson, a politician in the States. And what we see here is a part of one of those implants that was removed from him. What you see, the little round thing is a part of a coin, how small they are. His implants were of a medical type device. They were different than the encapsulated systems. And it comprised several parts that fell apart, basically, as it was taken out. Bob Boyce is an inventor, and he had a Faraday cage where he did some testing, and he detected some strange radio frequencies. He couldn't work out where they came from. And then he, after calibrating and checking all of his equipment, he had to conclude that the frequency was coming from him. And then, unfortunately, he got cancer and had that removed. And in the cancer, you see, there was a embedded microchip. So that's the danger of this. The radio frequencies are dangerous and cause cancer where they are implanted. So some of the things that we also do is we do questionnaires to work out what people have experienced and to see if there are any correlations to find out. It's very hard to find correlations among the victims. It seems to be very broad. We have majority are female. Psychiatry is, of course, the worst enemy. Even though, as I showed you, the technology has been around for 50 years. It has been done for 50 years now. If you ever mention that you might have a microchip into you, it's very likely you will get committed with a delusional disorder. Recently, we had a Danish victim who did, unfortunately, tell it straight out that he thinks he was implanted and he was committed. There's nothing, they won't listen, and they don't have time to investigate the possibility or feasibility or even do a scan or test or anything. So that's of course what we're up against, and that's utilized in this system to keep it from being exposed. Another thing that is very common is that almost all stories of the victims are nearly identical. They have been personalized to the surrounding and the individual, but they are almost identical, and it all usually starts with things that are moving in the apartment, some kind of surveillance, sometimes break-in, without things being stolen, things being moved around in the apartment, letting people know that they are under the system. Then there is a phase with gang stalking, basically where people are harassed and gang stalked by their surroundings. And then usually it turns on to more physical and psychological torture types of things, harassment. And in some cases the gang stalking continues, in other cases it disappears, it changes over time. But the stories are very consistent basically around the globe. And a lot of victims also have physical pains. Some of the pains are truly physical, but we are very certain in ICAACT that a lot of the things that people experience is due to what is called NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, where basically a person can be programmed to perceive anything. It was originally developed by Dr. Richard Bandler. He was a co-creator of the system. And he, of course, created it for humanitarian purposes to help people. But it is also known that he did teach the CIA and the FBI and other agencies how to use it in a negative fashion. So we know this system is used, and that could account for some of the physical symptoms because it's all perception. But we have seen a lot of people who have burn marks, etc. So there are more technologies in play. So I'm going to play a couple of recent statements. The first one I'm going to play is from a Hollywood production. So that's not really, doesn't account for anything, but this is the behind the scenes of a Hollywood production called The Recruit, and it's basically a recruitment film for the CIA. There's something odd about what he says. Have a good listen. Next up is Robert Baer. Some of you might have seen the movie Syriana. It's based on his first 2 books that were true accounts of his life. But this clip is a sound clip from his 3rd book, a fictional novel called Blow the House Down, that gives a somewhat alternative interpretation of what led to 9/11. Sometimes things that are true or could be true are best kept in fiction. Then we have Vice President Biden, and I'll touch on that. First, the recruit.
Many of our young officers are given actually amazing amounts of responsibility, because it's actually the youngest officers in the clandestine service that very often have the biggest and most important cases, because they are the ones who haven't yet been sort of tainted with the involvement in espionage.
Don't look now.
You being a suspected or absolutely confirmed CIA officer.
You can't trust your best friends. Your 5 senses, only the little voice inside you. Most civilians don't even hear. Trust yourself.
They have to have a skill that cannot be learned.
Most civilians don't hear it, okay?
Looking back on it now, I think that's the moment in this horrible skein I felt the sickest over. I fed India the bait, and she took it. Hook, line, and sinker. I'd recruited her. The truth jabbed me in the brain like a cranial probe. The faxes, the transcripts of KSM's calls, the methyl nitrate, Frank's options trades had all been boring deeply into my thoughts while India slept softly on my shoulder. Then I remembered a seminar on methyl nitrate I'd attended.
Those two don't really ever count for anything. They are fictional. But the next ones are interviews. Here's Joe Biden interviewing Supreme Court Justice Jackson, or before Robertson, I think his name was, before he was accepted.
Our constitutional journey did not stop then, and it must not stop now, Judge. And we'll be faced with equally consequential decisions in the 21st century. Can a microscopic tag be implanted in a person's body to track his every movement? There's actual discussion about that. You will rule on that, mark my words, before your tenure is over. Can brain scans be used to determine whether a person is inclined toward criminality or violent behavior? You will rule on that. And Judge, I need to know whether you will be a justice who believes that the constitutional journey must continue to speak to these consequential decisions, or that we've gone far enough in protecting against government intrusion into our autonomy, into the most personal decisions we make. Judge, that's why this is a critical moment. There are elected officials in this government, such as Mr. DeLay, a fine, honorable, patriotic man, and others, who have been unsuccessful at implementing their agenda in the elected branches. So they've now poured their energies, as the left would if it were different, they've now poured their energies and resources into trying to change the court's view of the Constitution.
Joe Biden, the vice president of the US, has been a politician for many years. He was actually a member of the investigation team that uncovered MKULTRA under Edward Kennedy. Just so he has a lot of insider knowledge to what's going on there. I have two clips that are important by one of the world's most eminent journalists, Bob Woodward, who uncovered the Watergate scandals. These are recent interviews on what's going on, and
Woodward reports for the first time that there is a secret behind the success of the surge, a sophisticated and lethal special operations program.
This is very sensitive and very top secret, but there are secret operational capabilities that have been developed by the military to locate, target, and kill leaders of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, insurgent leaders, renegade militia leaders. That is one of the true breakthroughs.
But what are we talking about here? Some kind of surveillance, some kind of targeted way of taking out just the people that you're looking for, the leadership of the enemy?
If you were an Al-Qaeda leader or part of the insurgency in Iraq or one of these renegade militias and you knew about what they were able to do, you'd get your ass out of town.
There is another revelation in your book about U.S. intelligence, and that is just how closely we are watching the Iraqi Prime Minister, supposedly our ally, Nouri al-Maliki.
There is significant surveillance of Maliki, and as one source told me, we know everything he says. And others I've talked to about that say you can't literally know everything, but we know a great deal.
So,
let's talk about the surge and what was accomplished from the surge. The administration is saying that the reduction in violence, whatever success is now being enjoyed in Iraq, is primarily because of the surge. Is that what your reporting proves?
No, it shows quite clearly that these new secret operations, on Friday the White House issued a statement in response to the book, and for the first time actually said there are newly developed techniques and operations that contributed to the lowering of violence.
Now, what are these new techniques? What can you tell us? Because of national security, you're not going to say specifically what they are. Can you categorize what kind of developments these are that you believe, that you report, have led to a reduction in violence and a greater ability to go after al-Qaeda in Iraq?
It's a big deal. You think about the Manhattan Project in World War II, developing the atomic bomb. It was all secret. All of a sudden, 2 bombs are dropped in Japan, and it's the end of the war. These techniques and operations you're not going to see or hear, but they are lethal and effective. I know a lot of the details about it. A 4-star general I went and talked to about this, the blood literally drained from his face, and he didn't make a request.
Because he knew about it.
Yes.
That's why he was so shocked.
And he did not make a request that it be withheld. He said, you cannot write about this. And when you look at the details and the nature of the operations, he and others are right. But
is this one weapon system, or is this a matrix of new developments?
I'm just, you know, the White House said it very much the way I said it, new techniques and operations.
New techniques and operations that you compare to the magnitude of the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, it's a game changer. It is the sort of thing that has allowed, if you look at the data on the drop in violence, there's a ski slope, literally, when violence goes down in the summer last year, 2007. This is when the surge forces are getting there, but that's when these techniques and operations are taking place. And I quote some people saying 85 to 90% of the actionable intelligence comes from these techniques and operations.
Mm-hmm. I think that sounds like a mixture of some of those technologies and harp-like technologies. Don't you? Sort of, we can pacify all the people, we can listen to what they say. That's basically what he describes. Next one is a NSA whistleblower. The NSA is the US biggest intelligence service, and they are responsible for communications. And
we're going to begin with William Binney. You worked for the National Security Agency for more than 3 decades.
Almost 4.
Almost 4 decades.
Yeah. So when they did that, those people came to me and said, you know, they're doing this, you know, and they told me what they were doing. And so I immediately went to the Intelligence Committee, because the Intelligence Committees were formed to have oversight over the intelligence community to make sure they didn't monitor U.S. citizens. This was a fallout of the Church Committee back in the 70s. Because the oversight that's given to the intelligence community is virtually non-existent from Congress. I mean, they're totally dependent, because they have no way of really knowing what's happening inside the agencies that are involved, unless they had people who would come forward and tell them, like me, for example. They would not know those things.
It needs to be out in the open. We need to, as a democracy, we need to say, do we want our government doing this or not? And do we want our government to have this data or not? And if so, if we want them to have it, then what kind of controls? And they have to be a little bit more visible. It can't all be done in secret. You can't have secret interpretations of laws and run them in secret and not tell anybody. We can't make up kill lists and not tell anybody what the criteria is for being in a kill list.
The number of people who've been indicted are more than all presidents combined in the past.
Right, and I think it's to silence what's going on. But the point is the data that's being assembled is about everybody. And from that data, then they can target anyone they want.
Bill Binney, talk about Bluffdale, Utah. What is being built there?
Well, a very large storage device, basically, for remote interrogation and remote processing. Well, a very large storage device, basically, for remote interrogation and remote processing. For remote interrogation and remote processing. For remote interrogation and remote processing. for remote interrogation and remote processing.
I couldn't help myself when I made this little cut. So, basically, this confirms it. Remote interrogation. So how would you imagine this would be done? Via satellites, implants. Both things are, according to the scientist, possible. And they are being done. And he's basically giving testimony to this. In history, the politicians have been aware of these technologies, and they have been covering this up and keeping it from the people. During the SALT agreements between the Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States, the Russians intensely tried to get some of those weapon systems into the SALT agreements. The Americans declined because they thought the Russians had an edge in this technology at the time. So, as Yeltsin left office, strange electronic devices were found in the panels in his office, psychotronic weaponry. So when you have Yeltsin in your mind as someone who had a vodka too much, it might not have been vodka. It caused some outcry in the Duma, and in 2001 they outlawed psychotronic weapons completely in Russia. Psychotronic weapons are weapon systems that can influence the thinking process. Unfortunately, this spring, Putin announced that he is starting research into those areas again. I don't know if this law is still around, but they are starting their research programs again. In 1998, the European Union invited Nick Begich and others and had a long discussion on these topics and drafted a resolution that expressly forbids and should prevent this from ever happening. The only problem with the resolution is it's not law. It's voluntary if the states want to adopt it or not. So we have those fine words, but at least they acknowledge that they have knowledge of it. In California, they had a very famous actor. They had several. They had Reagan. They also had Schwarzenegger, the governor. And he made a law that completely prohibited any injection of electronic sorts without full informed consent in people. So there is an awareness of that. And since that, California was the first state, and since that, 17 other states have followed. The law and justice, we have the medical oath, and there's the Nuremberg Code that basically should ensure that nothing is done without full and informed consent. These are extremely violated. United Nations Human Rights Declaration and the European Union's Human Rights Declaration are violated to an extent that is almost unbelievable, incomprehensible. It's time we get this to The Hague, and we hope we will get the smoking gun. What we will need at that point when we have the smoking gun is public outcry that will bring this to the politicians, that will make it visible. Because the way the media works at the moment, all bad things are basically suppressed and kept under the radar, no matter how bad they are, how extreme they are. But it's important that we get this attention if we come up with the smoking gun at some point. I have 2 little films on Denmark. I don't know how many Danes are here? Okay, I'll take them because they are on Danish things. Basically, there has been a war waged by the Danish Defense Intelligence Service against the civilian population. It was enacted in the former administration, where they were granted that they could spy and they could do surveillance on anybody they liked without warrants. This came out not so long ago, this spring, or actually late spring, as the current administration revealed that they have closed it down, and they have ordered the Defense Intelligence Service to destroy any recorded material, any collected material on those matters. We are at least 2 people here who have tried to address the intelligence services, the politicians, justice ministers, etc., to prevent them from destroying potential evidence, because these are extreme violations of our constitution. And after this came out, there was a curious little interview here. I'll just show a little clip of it.
Den militære efterretningstjeneste FE bliver kritiseret for at være for lukket og mangle demokratisk kontrol. Hverken offentligheden eller Folketinget har megen føling med tjenesten. Hvis den, der lever skjult, lever godt, så har Forsvarets efterretningstjeneste det fremragende. Den demokratiske kontrol er beskeden, og informationer om tjenestens arbejde bliver holdt på et minimum. En enkelt paragraf i Forsvarsloven giver enorm mulighed for aflytninger af danske borgere, uden at en dommer har taget stilling til det. Og det, selvom sikkerhed og retssikkerhed ifølge regeringen skal gå hånd i hånd.
For selvom efterretningstjenester, der aflytter borgerne uden retskendelse, lyder som noget, vi kender fra bananrepublikker, har Forsvarets efterretningstjeneste mandat til netop det. At aflytte borgernes telefonsamtaler, åbne deres breve og tjekke deres sms'er, uden først at spørge en domstol, som grundloven ellers kræver af politiet og andre myndigheder.
Som vi helt grundlæggende tror på, og vi tror sådan set på, at folketingsmedlemmerne holder øje med, hvad der sker, blandt andet i Forsvarets efterretningstjeneste, hvilket de også gør i kontroludvalget. Så jeg tror, der er en tillid. Altså, der skal rigtig, rigtig meget til, før at paragraf 17 vil kunne komme i anvendelse. Det skal være noget, hvor du og jeg ikke er i tvivl om. Nu kommer det tæt på.
Basically what he's saying is that we have to have confidence in them, but you have to imagine, intelligence services are by nature and by job description liars and deceivers. So how can anyone have confidence in professional liars and deceivers, thieves? That's one thing. The second thing is, in this interview that was done after the article came out, that they have ordered all of the material destroyed, the question is not even ever asked. This gives me a sense of the media. They don't even go into this. They say it might never have happened, is the consensus now. We don't know if there were any cases. Well, but a couple of weeks before this one, they did order it destroyed. So that's the media manipulation we see. I want to basically go into here. This is from last week. And once again, I'm shocked. I don't have a television. So I usually don't watch television, at least not after. I haven't really for many years. But there was this comment, and I was really upset by it. It deals with the basic human rights, and what is brought up in primetime Danish media is the discussion on whether or not basic human rights set out by the European Union or the UN are a part of our history or culture, or if they are dangerous to our national state.
Er menneskerettigheder en naturlig del af den danske kultur, eller er de direkte farlige? Den debat bølger frem og tilbage i pressen, og om lidt tager vi den her i studiet. Og så god eftermiddag til Søren Krarup, forhenværende folketingsmedlem, forhenværende præst og i den grad nuværende debattør, som det fremgår. Også velkommen til dig, Jakob Mchangama, CEPOS chefjurist. Lad mig starte med dig og et håb om, du måske kan svare på nogle af de spørgsmål, som Marie Krarup og Søren Krarup har rejst, nemlig hvorfor har vi overhovedet menneskerettighederne, og hvad skal de egentlig gøre godt for? Det er måske noget, der ikke står så præsent i den almindelige danskers hverdag, i hvert fald ikke i min. Så hvad er svaret?
Well, basically what upsets me is that we have this discussion at all. So it's not what they actually discussed, but having this discussion and questioning if they are valid, I think is enormously dangerous, and it is this main government TV channel that is trying to put this in people's mind, that we might not need the human rights anymore. So. I want to close with this.
What if some product of neuroscientific research could convince all nations, including those labeled rogue states, the great Satan, or members of the axis of evil, to eliminate entirely their weapons of mass destruction. Imagine that degree of promise rooted in the same body of research that could also manifest weapons so gruesome we can barely conceive of them. Governments with untold billions at their disposal are steadily increasing their investment in neurotechnology. We're on the cusp of eerie and disturbing developments that seem like they've been taken straight out of the Manchurian Candidate. Sophisticated neuroweapons for coercive truth detection and the erasure of memories are already on the horizon. Neuro-warfare is already a fact. Its expansion is as inevitable as the massive changes coming in all the other segments of society. In an article published a decade ago by the U.S. Army War College, military analyst Timothy Thomas used the title, "The Mind Has No Firewall." Like the gigantic shifts of humanity's past, our emerging neurosociety is a wild card. It holds enormous, seemingly equal promise for inducing an age of bliss or a living nightmare. The reason so much more is at stake in this epochal change is that our newest tools will give us nothing less than increasingly precise control over the most powerful factor in our lives, our own minds. Here is what I believe to be the overarching question. Does a citizen's right to privacy include his or her inner domain of thought? Depending on how we answer questions like these, the emerging technologies may be used to control us and keep us in cultural or economic bondage.
That was basically it from me. Unless there are any questions. Okay.
These people that were implanted.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can't say. Do you mean the people you scanned or those that have been removed?
Both.
Okay.
I want to ask you, were they aware themselves that they had been implanted, or did they just have the symptoms? And afterwards, when it came out, or when they were operated on, and the implant came out, did they know or remember that they had been in some kind of operation, or how did it get in there? How did they get implanted?
We don't know, actually. We don't know. Dave Larson's, I think, might have been a surgery at some point he had done. Bob Boyce was done covertly. But neither of them had big-time symptoms, as far as I know. I don't know about David Larson's, if he was symptomatic of some of those. But the majority of the people we scan, we cannot yet claim that they are implanted, but they think it's a possibility that they might be, because they are subjected to this, and that's why they want to be scanned. And as long as we don't have the smoking gun, we cannot claim it. We have, at this point, we have circumstantial evidence. But when people look at this, how can they do all of those things they are capable of? I'm not going to go into all of the specifics of what they are capable of doing. But twisting their mind that being implanted is a feasible, how to explain that? How would you explain that when you know this is not a mental thing? I think all of the victims are aware that this is not a delusion or anything like that. Of course, if you tell the story, it will be perceived as that, and a lot of people have been committed on those grounds, and that's a plausible deniability that's built into the system to systematically discredit people. And if they get labeled with some kind of diagnosis, like delusional disorder or anything else, their reputation and their statement in all future will be hugely diminished. And that's part of the original, I think they want people to get the diagnosis like that, specifically to diminish the person's credibility. So it's all about bringing awareness to this is very, very important. If any one of you ever hears of that, or someone in your friends or surroundings talks about that, you cannot go to a doctor or the police, for that matter, or anything, and say, I might be implanted, they are doing this to me. Not even gang stalking or anything like that, because the whole system is built with plausible deniability, and most people will get shipped right off to the psychiatry.
I think we will say thank you to Lars Drudgaard for his presentation. The hour is late, and should we give him the last hand?
Thank you.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Lars will also participate the next days. So if you have questions, you're welcome to talk to Lars when we have breaks and things like that.
I just have a last word. There's a box with DVDs out on the, what do you call it, reception. And they're free, you can take them. There's a little bit of material on the scanning we did on us, and there's an interview with Barry Trower on it as well. So I recommend you take one. There are only 100 in the box, so when they are out, they are out.